You're watching Around the World, our top global stories. Straight up, Russia's President Vladimir Putin, who has made it clear that Russia will press on with its invasion of Ukraine. A day after American President Biden's surprise trip to Ukraine, Putin delivered his annual State of the Union address to both houses of the Russian parliament, an address that is watched keenly by the elites of Russia, where Putin was expected to update the country about the special military operation in Ukraine. And Putin vowed to systematically press on with Moscow's offensive in Ukraine, even as he lambasted Western powers for turning Ukraine against Russia. He also made sure Russia exited a nuclear arms treaty pact that it signed with the US, as Putin accused the West of practically paving the way to power for Nazis in Germany. And now they've turned Ukraine into anti-Russia, according to Putin. Now, Putin was claiming that the support for Ukraine from Western allies has been waning and will eventually fade out. Now, the face of Western allies, America's President Joe Biden, debunked that myth by giving a surprise visit to war-stricken Ukraine, reassuring all support to Zelensky. This came after Western allies reiterated support to Ukraine at the Munich Security Council meeting in Germany. There was no big, flashy Air Force One for this trip. Instead, President Biden vanished into darkness on an Air Force C-32, a modified Boeing 757 flight that is normally used for domestic trips. After a refueling stop in Germany, Biden's plane switched off its transponder for the roughly hour-long flight from there to Poland. Biden then traveled by train from Poland across Ukraine for his surprise visit to Kyiv. He was on board the train for roughly 10 hours. The President of America was traveling with a far smaller than usual retinue, joined by a Secret Service detail, the military aide carrying the so-called nuclear football, a small medical team, the official White House photographer, and only 2 journalists instead of the usual complement of 13 people. And while Biden was in Kyiv, American surveillance planes, including the E-3 Sentry airborne radar and many others, were keeping watch over Kyiv from Polish airspace. The president had been itching since last year to join the bandwagon of other Western powers who have visited Kyiv and pledged support, standing shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. Joe Biden announced that the US will deliver a new package of additional aid worth $500 million to Ukraine, and that will include artillery ammunition, anti-armor systems, and air surveillance radars. Germany, Norway, France, and major global economies in Europe had vouched for more support to Ukraine at the recently held Munich Security Conference as well. Meanwhile, Biden arrived in Warsaw in Poland and met with Poland's President Andrzej Duda, along with other leaders of NATO countries after his trip to Ukraine. But even as Biden makes these diplomatic moves, China's top diplomat Wang Yi is due to visit Moscow and may possibly even meet Putin. Currently in Europe, Wang Yi, during a stop in Hungary, had said that China wants a political solution to provide a peaceful and sustainable framework to Europe. Over the weekend, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken warned against China providing weapon support to Russia, prompting China to tell the US to mind its own business. Meanwhile, Russian attacks continued along the 1,200-kilometer-long war front line in Ukraine. The attacks were primarily concentrated in Donetsk, Luhansk, and Zaporizhzhia regions in eastern Ukraine. Nearly 700 civilians have been killed in the month of January alone this year. The United Nations' Commissioner for Human Rights has stated that nearly 20,000 civilians have been killed in Ukraine since the beginning of the war. Moving on, over 100,000 people took to the streets in Israel again. Mass protests have engulfed the country against the judicial reforms proposed by the new government led by Prime Minister Netanyahu. But defying the mass uproar and calls for restraint from America, Netanyahu's government, for the first time, advanced the plan to overhaul the country's legal system. Crowded railway stations, blocked roads, vehicles of politicians stopped, chants of democracy, and placards that read, "When dictatorship becomes a fact, revolution becomes a right." These are scenes on the streets of Israel for the past couple of days. But despite all of that, Netanyahu's far-right coalition government is moving ahead with the controversial legislation, a bid to restrict the power of the judiciary, the power of the courts in Israel. It's part of a broader package of changes that seeks to weaken Israel's Supreme Court and transfer more power to the ruling government. The vote in the parliament, split by 63 to 47, gave initial approval to the plan that will give the government more power over who becomes a judge in Israel. The legislators cast their votes after a vitriolic debate that dragged on past midnight. During the session, opposition lawmakers chanted shame and wrapped themselves in the Israeli flag, and some were even thrown out of the hall altogether.
חברי הכנסת בקואליציה, לא לעזור לי, תודה.
Now, that vote marked only a preliminary approval for the plan, but it raised the stakes in a political battle, drawing tens of thousands to the streets and sparking criticism from influential sections of Israel's society. Those in Netanyahu's favor say these changes are needed to rein in the powers of an unelected judiciary. However, critics fear that judges will be appointed based on their loyalty to the government or the Prime Minister. It's also imperative to point out here that Netanyahu faces trial on corruption charges and has a conflict of interest in this legislation. Meanwhile, the showdown has plunged Israel into one of its most bitter domestic crises. Rifts are widening in an already polarized country, with both sides insisting that the future of democracy is at stake. Israeli Palestinians, a minority, may have the most to lose by this judicial overhaul due to the discrimination they face at home and Israel's ongoing 55-year-long occupation of their brethren in the West Bank. However, the vote on part of the legislation is just the first of 3 readings required for a full parliamentary approval, a process that is expected to take months in Israel. Shifting focus to Turkey and Syria, where 2 weeks after the disastrous set of earthquakes, 2 more powerful earthquakes have hit Turkey's southern regions and Syria as well. The very regions that were the hardest hit from the first set of earthquakes. They were struck by another earthquake of 6.5 magnitude, followed by a 5.8 magnitude quake. More buildings collapsed, trapping more people and leaving the city in the south of Turkey in shock. The government of Turkey's Hatay province confirmed the death of 3 people, and more than 200 people have been wounded as well. People were out of their homes and on the streets in fear as ambulance and rescue vehicles rushed around the city. As the search and rescue teams continue, more excavators were seen moving the debris of collapsed buildings. The quake was near the southern Turkish city of Antakya and was also felt in nearby Syria, as well as Egypt, Israel, and Lebanon. The latest quakes killed 6 people in Syria, and more than 130 have been reported injured. Frightened residents in the Syrian city of Idlib were seen preparing to sleep in open public spaces, getting as far as possible from buildings that might collapse. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said on his visit to Turkey on Monday that the United States would help Turkey for as long as it takes, as the focus turned to shelter and reconstruction work. Turkey's President Erdogan said that construction work on nearly 200,000 apartments in 11 provinces of Turkey would begin next month. Now, an Iranian foundation has lauded the man who attacked writer Salman Rushdie last year and announced that it will reward him with 1,000 square meters of agricultural land. A 24-year-old Shiite Muslim American from New Jersey attacked Rushdie on the stage of a literary event in Western New York in the month of August last year. Rushdie has now fully recovered despite losing an eye and the use of one hand after that attack. And he has even given his first camera interview post-recovering from that gruesome attack. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, the supreme leader of Iran, 33 years ago, called on Muslims to assassinate Salman Rushdie a few months after the release of his book, The Satanic Verses, in a religious ruling known as a fatwa. The attack on Rushdie in 2022 took place more than 3 decades after Khomeini made the statement. And finally, the world's biggest party has begun. Brazil's Rio Carnival has kicked off. The pandemic had delayed and muted carnival festivities over the last couple of years, and even then, they were largely restricted only to the locals. But this year, it's back with a bang. Samba songs were ringing out till dawn at Rio de Janeiro's sold-out parade grounds. Colorful floats and flamboyant dancers delighted tens of thousands jammed into Rio de Janeiro's iconic Sambadrome. Rio's Sambadrome has been home to the parade since the 1980s and is a symbol of Brazil's carnival festivities. Rio de Janeiro's carnival began with the mayor of Rio, Eduardo Paes, ceremoniously handing control of the city to King Momo, regarded as the king of carnivals, and opening the first ever full-on carnival since 2020. This year's parade comes back to its original date, celebrated between the Friday before Ash Wednesday and Ash Wednesday itself, 47 days before Easter. This after cancellations and rescheduling due to the COVID pandemic in 2021 and 2022. Brazil's federal government expects 46 million people to join the festivities this year. It officially began on Friday last week and will run through till the 22nd of February. The city of Sao Paulo, too, kicked off its world-famous carnival parade with some of Brazil's top samba schools performing at the Anhembi Sambadrome in Sao Paulo. Sao Paulo city has recently emerged as a carnival hotspot. Along with the carnival, hundreds of raucous, roaming street parties also flood the streets. Most tourists are eager to go to these street parties known as blocos. Carnival street parties continued in Rio de Janeiro as revelers headed to Flamengo Beach with drums and dancing. Authorities have permitted more than 600 street parties during this year's carnival, a drastic contrast to the last couple of years where there were no street parties. Street parties will go on this year until this weekend, officially ending on the 26th of February, that's a Sunday. And that's all we have time for in this edition of Around the World. Thank you so much for watching. Keep it with News 9+.